Hey, this is Molly Patrick, and you're listening to the Clean Food Dirty Girl podcast. We are all about helping people eat more plants and celebrating imperfection as we navigate life's messiness. Hey there, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Clean Food Dirty Girl podcast. I'm really excited today because we have a very special guest. We have Brenda Davis, who is a registered dietitian. She has written many books. I have talked with her before on the podcast and for our YouTube channel about soy. It was a great conversation. And she has this book out, Plant-Powered Protein, which caught my eye. And this is a fabulous resource. So we're going to dive into protein today. Brenda, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Oh, well, I'm so happy to be with you again, Molly. Thanks so much for having me.
Always a pleasure to talk with you. You're so knowledgeable about nutrition and plant-based nutrition. And so I really wanted to have a conversation specifically about protein because it's an important topic and it comes up a lot. And I've been seeing some variations on what is being recommended out there. And I wanted to talk with somebody who is an expert. I wanted to get right to the source and talk with you and ask questions. And also our community has a bunch of questions that I'm going to ask on their behalf as well. So can we just start with like a very brief a brief introduction just about protein? And, at this point, it seems like it's much more widely accepted that you can get protein from plants or you can get protein from animals. If you're going to be plant-based, like that's not a problem. You don't have to eat meat to get protein. But I know that wasn't always the case, right? There used to be a much bigger debate about that. So can you just start with a little introduction about protein and plant-based protein?
Oh, absolutely. So protein is one of the three key macronutrients, and it is a really important macronutrient. And so for so many years, people believed that in order to get enough high quality protein, you had to eat animal products. And we really judged the quality of protein on the amino acid profile of the protein, the essential amino acid profile relative to human needs, and the digestibility of the protein. But we didn't take into account, and I think this is a really important point, the impact of protein on disease risk. We didn't take into account the impact of various protein sources on the environment. So we left out a lot in our definition of protein quality. And if we factor in those points, it gives us a little broader view of protein quality. And so to me, protein quality is about essential amino acids. It is about digestibility, but it is also about what protein source will best protect human health in the long term and work best for, all life on this planet. And so I think plant protein has risen in terms of our views about protein sources. And we can absolutely meet our protein needs on a plant-based diet. And that's, not, I think, debatable anymore. And, we used to even say you need to combine grains with legumes or different types of protein sources to ensure that we receive all of the essential amino acids. And we now know that we don't need to do that if we eat a variety of foods over the course of the day and we get enough calories, we're going to get a reasonable variety of all of the essential amino acids. Every single plant food has all 9 essential amino acids. Plants are essentially where they come from. So it doesn't make any sense to think we can't get them from plants. Of course we can get them from plants. So that, and the other thing I should say is protein has probably become one of the most polarized topics within the plant-based nutrition space. We have views contrasting that we need to be eating a lot more protein to, protein is never an issue as long as we meet our caloric requirements, to we should be eating low amounts of protein for longevity. So we're kind of all over the place, and consumers are understandably a little bit confused.
Right. Okay. So I really love that you brought that into the conversation and saying, well, when we talk about the quality of protein, let's look at it as a more holistic view and like the bigger picture and what's going to be best for humans over the long term. So I think that
Yes.
adding in those additional kind of qualifiers is a really good way to decide, okay, well, what is, the most quality protein that I could have when you factor in all the rest of that stuff. So I think that that's really a wonderful point to make. And as far as the polarizing, effect of protein, you're right. And I see it even within our own community. And I think that it leaves people pretty confused because it is a really important nutrient. It's one of the macronutrients, like you said. And because it is so important, people want to make sure that, I'm getting enough, but not too much. But, they want to be protected and they want to do what's going to be best for them. And so, we can get protein from plants. I always tell people I've never eaten meat my whole life. So, if we couldn't get enough protein from, without eating meat, I would be in serious trouble. I'm going to be 45 this year and I'm doing well. So I like that you said it's no longer really debatable. Like we can get it from plants. It's okay.
Absolutely. And Molly, I just have to add, I haven't been doing it my whole life like you, but I'm 66 years old and I've been doing it for about 36 years, I would say, and probably 40 years, mostly plant-based. And so, I'm one of the strongest people in my, fitness classes. I can still do a lot of push-ups. I have no problem with muscle wasting. So it absolutely is possible, and many people do very well. Even bodybuilders can manage very well on a completely plant-based diet, like we see in the Game Changers, for example.
Yes. Yeah, and there's a lot of plant-based, bodybuilders out there, actually. I was
Yes.
looking at that because I would like to have a vegan bodybuilder on the show, so I'm looking for somebody who will come on, and I was like, actually, there are quite a lot of them out there, and
Lot.
wow, they are impressive. So, yeah, and athletes in general. So I think, I love this. So I want to talk about recommendations because I think that that's, the science of protein and all of that can be very interesting. But I think where the rubber kind of meets the road is people want to say, okay, well, how much should I be getting? And
Yes.
so I know that in this book, this plant powered protein book is really good. It's really like digestible information. It's not too much information. It's presented in a way that's really clear. They have little charts with, how much protein plants have, and you have very clear recommendations in here. So anybody who's curious about this, I highly recommend getting a copy of this.
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
yeah, it's a beautiful book, and it has some really yummy looking recipes as well.
Oh, and I should say about the recipes, we had I think five testers, and they were determined that every recipe would get 5 stars across the board before it made the book. So the
Very
recipes
important.
are really good.
Nice. Yes. Well, I know that our audience will appreciate that because we love to eat and we
Yes.
love good food. So I want to talk about recommendations. So first, if we could just go through some of the most common like demographics and kind of
Yes.
you tell me, okay, well, one thing I want to say before we start this is I learned something from your book, and I did not know when you're talking about the digestibility of protein that in plant-based eaters who eat, most whole food plant-based eaters eat a lot of fiber. And so plant-based eaters actually, it's recommended that they eat a little bit more protein to compensate for all of the fiber and some of the protein not being absorbed because it's going out with the fiber. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So generally, when a food is high in fiber, some of the protein will be excreted. It'll go right through the gut, right through the intestinal tract, and be excreted in the stool. And so we lose a little bit of protein when we have a lot of fiber. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but If your protein intake is just kind of barely meeting recommended levels, then you might want to boost your protein intake by, 10% or 15% or something like that. Most people get significantly more than the recommended, than the RDA. And they really don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about it also if you're eating enough high protein, lower fiber foods. For example, soy milk, tofu, peanut butter, veggie meats, the seitan. These kinds of foods are lower in fiber, very high in protein. So if they're part of the mix, you really don't need to adjust. Most adults don't need to adjust. For young children who tend to have little tiny stomachs, and they have fairly low protein requirements. So, for example, a toddler might need about 13 grams of protein a day based on the RDA of 1.05 grams per kilogram of body weight. So, at that small intake of protein, which you can get from, 2 cups of soy milk or one serving of tofu, we might want to add a little bit onto their, to maybe make it 15 or 16 grams instead of 13, for example.
Yeah.
But there was a study called VETCHI, and there were 2 sets of cohorts, the VETCHI toddler study and the VETCHI youth study, that showed in toddlers, the average toddler, whether omnivorous, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, or vegan, gets over double the RDA for protein.
Right.
So generally, it's not a huge issue. So, if you're barely meeting protein intake and you're eating a ton of fiber, then yes, it makes sense, especially if you're not eating very many lower fiber, higher protein foods, to add a little bit of padding, an extra 10%, which
Right.
is, not a lot.
Yeah, and that's easy to do because really all plant foods have a certain amount of protein, which is another reason why eating a wide range of whole plant foods is really
Yes.
important, because you can get 2 grams here, 3 grams there, 1 gram here. It all adds up quickly, especially if you're eating, big, beautiful salads with grains and beans and veggies. So it's not,
Yes.
if you're trying to pad a little bit, it's not going to take that many more calories, especially if it's coming from plants. Right.
No, not at all. You'd be surprised how easy it is to get protein from, 50 grams a day to 60 or 70.
Right.
It's really very simple.
Yes, and I want to talk about that in a little bit, like your little easy protein boosters. So we're going to get to that.
Yes.
So let's just talk about the RDA. So that's the recommended daily allowance, and that is set by the Food and Drug Administration. Is that who sets the RDA?
The Institute of Medicine.
Institute of Medicine. Okay.
Yeah, and so it's set at 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. At that level, is very reasonable for people who are eating a good number of calories.
Okay, so that's 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight.
2.2 pounds for
Right.
those.
Okay,
that
so
are-
I'm going to give a little example so people can get into reference. So I weigh 135 pounds, so that would be 61 kilograms. So
Yeah.
for me, 0.8 would be like 48.8 grams of protein.
Yeah,
a day.
that's what I was going to say. It's about 50 grams of protein. So that's kind of where you would shoot for if you're eating a lot of calories. Now, if you're an active individual who is, moderate in their caloric intake, you might want to aim closer to 1 gram per kilogram body weight. If you're an older adult, so you're 60 plus like me, you actually digest protein less efficiently. And you may want to add, and this, the consensus is building around how much protein older adults actually need. but the consensus is building that it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight that would be, ideal. Now, if you have some sort of issue, sarcopenia, something like that, fragility, you may want to boost that a little further to get closer to the 1.4 to 1.6, for example.
And that would be like if you are experiencing muscle like decline. That's not the right
Yes.
word for it, but
Yeah, no,
that's
it's fine description that you're the muscle loss,
okay.
basically, and that increases your risk for falls and
Okay.
all sorts of, issues of aging.
Okay. So that would, so you said 1.4 at the higher end of that?
Or probably 1.6 at the higher end.
1.6. Okay.
Yeah.
So that would be if somebody weighed 135 pounds, 61 kilograms, that would be like 97.6
Yeah, which is a
grams.
lot. And
Okay.
especially for an older senior woman, uh, that's not easy to achieve without, some sort of more concentrated protein source. And so, but that's not your average senior. That is someone who's struggling or who's
Right.
recovering from an injury or something like that and requires more protein to build or rebuild body tissue.
Okay. So if we have somebody who's over 65 and they are not experiencing those particular circumstances, it would be, is it 1, did you say?
1 to 1.2.
1 to
And I
1.2.
like to
Okay.
shoot for 1.2
Okay.
it just is a little bit of a cushion for the lower digestibility, especially as we age, we tend to eat fewer calories. So
Right.
that would help to compensate for that as well.
Okay. So that's like 73 grams a day. Okay. So these recommendations, are there any differences between the recommendations for men and the recommendations from women?
Okay, before I forget, it just occurred to me that I didn't mention your body weight that you're calculating your protein needs based on
Yeah.
is actually your healthy body weight. So let's say you weighed 75 kilos, but your healthy weight is 60 kilos. Your protein requirement is based on 60 kilos, not 75.
Okay, this is very helpful. Okay, so then if I weighed 135 pounds, let's just say, and for
Yeah.
my frame, if I was like, very short and that was like too much, then I would aim for like a healthy weight for my frame, whatever that would be,
That's right.
and not actually
And
calculate from my current weight.
that is exactly right. So for example, if you were trying to think of, well, what is my healthy weight? I weigh 150 pounds. What should I weigh? Think about the weight. If you were ever at a healthy weight, think about the weight that you felt the best at. Maybe, your college weight or whatever. And that would be the weight that you would be calculating your protein needs based
Okay.
on. I mean, you could use BMI if you've never been at a healthy weight and
Okay.
to calculate what a reasonable protein intake is for you. It is
And
not based on actual body weight if
okay,
you're overweight. It's
right.
based on healthy body weight.
And if you're underweight as well, I would imagine you would base it on a healthy weight as well.
Absolutely.
Right.
And because if you're underweight, you're trying to gain muscle mass, you may want to go a little bit higher because of that as well.
Right. That makes sense. Well, I've always heard healthy, that's a really good distinction because I think if you're calculating, if you're 50 pounds or 100 pounds overweight and you're calculating from that number, that's going to be way too much than you actually need then.
Oh, exactly. Way more than what you actually
Right.
need.
Okay. So that's a great, great distinction. I think that alone is going to be very helpful for people. And then as far as, you mentioned BMI, what do you think do you go with just like the what is the healthy average BMI that you would like to see?
Well, a healthy BMI is considered anything between 18.5 and 24.9. Now, there are a lot of caveats because, for example, a muscular, athletic man or bodybuilder will have a BMI well over 25 and still have an extremely low body fat, so they're not overweight. So this is useless for people that are muscular athletes. Okay.
Right.
It's
Okay.
also, to me, not great that it doesn't distinguish men from women because men tend to have more muscle. They tend to have heavier bones. And so, what is a healthy BMI for a man will generally be a little bit higher than what it would be for a woman. By the same token, a person that is small framed, like an Asian person, will be overweight at a lower BMI
Right.
than a person with a larger body frame. And so for many Asians, you're looking at, the 18.5 to maybe 23 as a healthy BMI. But of course, not every Asian person is the same. There will be some with bigger bones, some with smaller bones, but generally they'll be healthier at a lower body weight. And in fact, it always shocks me to see if you look at the BMI of many Asian women, it'll look like it's just perfectly in the middle of the healthy BMI zone, but they're actually overweight and have insulin resistance because they're carrying too much fat in their liver and pancreas. And so we get them to lose weight. And it seems weird to be telling someone who's 115 pounds that they need to lose weight. But in some cases, that is actually too much for their frame. And you store, this sort of ectopic fat in these vital organs, and that drives insulin resistance. So it's very individual. So while BMI can be a useful tool, it's not a perfect tool. And there are lots of caveats where BMI is concerned.
Yeah, very important. So what would be a more like I know that there's certain machines that you can get in and that really calculates things a lot more
Well, your
specific.
percentage body fat is probably, whatever. I mean, there's some scales you step on, there's water immersion, there's all kinds of DEXA scans and all kinds of things that can help you figure out your level of visceral fat versus subcutaneous fat and so on. And that's really ideal if you can do something like that. It will help you to determine whether or not you're actually overweight, because overweight is really overfat. So you're storing excess fat in your, worse is in, is viscerally or ectopic fat right in, either around vital organs or within vital organs. And that's not good news for metabolic health. And so we use subcutaneous fat near the surface of your skin is safer. But we really don't want to be storing a lot of excess fat. We want a little bit because that will help us to get through illness and things like that. But we don't want excess to the point that it actually fuels metabolic disease.
And I really like what you said because I think that so many people can overthink this and it's important stuff, but because most people don't have their, these tools to really measure precisely, people don't often have them accessible. And BMI is sort of limited. You said, think back to a weight where you felt really good and kind of aim for that. And I like that because then it's sort of like, okay, we can kind of just go from there as a starting point. So
Absolutely.
is there any distinction between men and women, or is it just like across the board, this is the recommendation?
Yeah, no, there's no distinction between men and women whatsoever.
Okay. And let's talk about women who are perimenopausal, because I hear this a lot. I've been hearing this a lot more. that women, once they get into perimenopause and also postmenopause, their needs are going to change. So we were talking about um, individuals who are 65 and over, right? Talking
Yes.
about like one, aiming for 1 or 1.2. But what about people who are more in that perimenopausal state? Is there any considerations for that?
Uh, I would say, depending on your level of physical activity, generally, if you're an athlete, you're going 1.2 to 1.6. If you're an active individual, I think aiming for 1.2 is a good place to be in perimenopause. That would be my recommendation. If you're reasonably active, if you're not, maybe 1 would be enough. I generally think that for a lot of people, point 0.8, especially if you're whole food plant based, may be a little on the low side. And here's where the men and women come in. It's point 0.8 for a man, it's point 0.8 for a woman. If you're a teenager, it's 0.85 for a man or woman. If you're a child, it's around 1 for a boy or a girl. So no difference there whatsoever. The only time it increases is during pregnancy and lactation, where it goes up to 1.1 in pregnancy and 1.3 during lactation. So those are recommendations. Now, I think it's worth saying that in North America, we don't have separate RDAs for older adults, but there are recommendations for older adults in many countries, in Australia, in many of the Nordic, well, all of the Nordic countries, in Germany. So there are many countries in Europe that have higher recommendations. And so there's a tendency to go towards adding, 20-25% to the RDA for older adults, which, adding, whatever 20 or 25% for athletes is no big deal at all, because they're eating so many calories. It's easy for them to meet those needs. But when they're actually reducing calories relative to younger adults, what it means is you have less room for discretionary calories.
Yeah.
So you have less room for the treats. You need to focus more on nutrient-dense foods. And that's hard, because often as we approach our senior years, or for older adults, a lot of older adults really like their treats. So it's not an easy thing to juggle. And so what I tell a lot of people is to focus a little more on the beans and the tofu and soy milk rather than almond milk. All of these more concentrated protein sources need to feature more prominently in the diet of older adults.
Wonderful points. I would just want to circle back to this one thing. You said for a reasonably active person, right? It might be like 1.2.
Yes.
What do you consider reasonably active?
Well, I would say for someone that is at least meeting the recommended, fitness goals of 150 minutes per week of moderate to intense physical activity. And, I myself aim for an hour a day or slightly more, depending of dedicated, at least moderate to hard physical activity. And so for someone that's doing that much activity, I think that's a reasonable place to be.
Okay. Yes. I had a question. How do you know if you're an athlete? But if you have to ask, you're probably not.
Yeah, no. An athlete, and I could be wrong. I think of an athlete as someone who is competing. So they're training for competition.
Right.
And
Yes.
and that means often they're training for much more than an hour a day.
Yeah. It's like they dedicate their life. I mean, I know some people who compete in bodybuilding, and that's their whole life. So yeah. Okay. So okay, I love all those recommendations. I just want to go from my notes to make sure I didn't miss anything with the recommendations. Okay. We did that. Yep. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about so we have a bunch of questions. I want to ask you questions, but I want to talk first about this article that's been going around, and I emailed it to you because I've been having a lot of people in our community send it to me. And the recommendations, the woman links to some studies in this article, and she really talks about the fact that women have been excluded from a lot of the studies that the RDAs are ultimately based on. And so her recommendations are actually much higher than the RDA. And so I wanted to talk with you about this just to see, is this accurate? Is there weight in this? Do people need to be paying attention to this? Is this information that's helpful, not helpful, hurtful? Like I would love to know. Um, so can we talk a little bit about that?
Well, the weight of the evidence does not support her recommendation. So, the weight of the evidence, based on recommendations from leading protein authorities globally, is in the range that I was talking about. To say that people should aim for 2 or more grams per kilogram per day really exceeds practical intake levels for most people, and for plant-based eaters specifically, unless they're supplementing with a lot of protein powder. And there's just not clear consensus that, for the general population, there's any need to do this. If you get to protein intakes that are that high, it's often consuming animal products, and it means very high intakes of saturated fat. You will be displacing foods that are super valuable, like fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, to get to that level.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are, in my view, some concerns with going to that level of intake. So you're looking at, for a 60-kilogram woman, you're looking at about 120 grams of protein a day if you say 2 grams per kilogram.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's like I say, it's not sustainable, but I think it could actually be harmful. So there are a lot of studies showing that very high protein intakes beyond 20% of calories, and at 2 grams per kilogram, you're looking at about 24 or 25% of calories from protein. It increases morbidity and mortality. And that is reduced if the protein comes from plants, but you're not going to achieve that level of protein intake from whole plant foods. It's just not possible because, if you look at whole plant foods, they average, so legumes average around 20 to 30% of calories from protein. Grains are around 10 to 17. Some are a little lower, like rice. Nuts and seeds are around, 8 to 17. Vegetables can be, 20, 30%. Fruits are 1 to 10%. But if you do a mix of all of those things, you're not going to be getting to that 25% level easily. And that level of protein intake means higher IGF-1 levels, higher methionine intake, which has been associated with probably a little higher risk of cancer. And so there are some concerns about going to that level of protein intake, and especially when it's absolutely unnecessary.
Yeah, and that was my question because I've wondered, like, okay, to get to that amount of protein on a whole food plant-based diet, like you're gonna have to eat so much food, and it's gonna be so hard to get that amount in, and because we
Yeah,
know
unless
that,
you're eating 3 or 4,000 calories a day.
right?
Most people eat closer to 2,000, and so it just means a huge percentage of calories from protein, and it's really not achievable unless
Yeah.
you're doing protein powders and such, and that's not something I would recommend, and it's just not necessary.
Right. Yeah, and I kind of like calculated sort of what I naturally get in a day because I don't count calories or protein. Like, I just eat a wide range of whole plant foods. I
Yes.
eat, really hearty meals, and focus on lots of beans and legumes and tofu and veggies and all of this. And so I don't count stuff, but I was just curious. I'm like, okay, so my recommended is about like 55 grams, I guess, right? 55 grams. And yesterday or the day before, I had, according to my calculations, around 80 grams. And that was
Which,
like
yeah, which
without,
is very typical of someone who's eating a varied diet and they're active so they can eat enough calories. They're not on a 1,400 calorie diet or something.
right.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit smaller person, but I easily get 60, 65 grams a day. And my recommended, even if I was going for 1 gram per kilogram, would be 50 grams.
Right.
I do like to shoot for 1.2,
Yeah.
and I'm certainly there.
Right.
And I don't eat excessively, but I eat pretty generous portions as well.
Same here. And if I would need to shoot for like that recommendation that's like really, really high, I would have needed, like, I was like, okay, well, what could I eat? I would need to eat another like 42 to 60 grams on top
Yeah,
of
it's
that.
crazy.
And so
Yeah.
it was like a half a cup of edamame, a half a cup of lentils, a quarter cup of hemp seeds, a half a cup of broccoli, a quarter cup of oats, and 2 more bananas, which would have been an additional almost 700 calories, which
Yeah.
would have, made my calorie intake for the day way more than I actually need. And so
Yes, exactly.
and because we know like an excess of animal-based protein is bad news. Is an excess of plant-based protein also is it negligible, or is that also doing harm? And you may have touched on that a little bit, but I wanted to circle back.
Yeah, no, and we have less information suggesting that if protein is coming from whole foods, that from whole plant foods, that it would have any adverse impact. We do know that it can increase IGF-1 levels a little bit, which is good for the bones, but not so good for, cancer risk reduction. So there's a happy medium there. So
Right.
but generally, yeah, I mean, it's just we just need to be aware
Right.
of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so from your point of view and from your expertise, the guidelines that we went over that are in your book that we just talked about, those stand, and anything above that is not necessary and potentially harmful. Is that accurate?
I would say definitely if it's coming from animal products, it's potentially harmful. So, and we've quantified this.
Yeah.
We've got all kinds of studies that have quantified the impacts. And there was one study that I think is interesting that looked at high protein intake and mortality. And this was over 6,000 individuals. It was an 18-year follow-up. And they found that people that were consuming more than 20% of calories from protein, so she's recommending probably closer to 25%, that it increased mortality 75%. And it increased cancer and diabetes mortality fourfold. So that's 400%. Now, these associations with animal and this was the case when the protein came, from a mix of animal and plant foods, but the associations were either abolished or greatly attenuated when the protein came from plants. So we don't see the same kind of negative consequences from plant protein, from high intakes of plant protein, as we do from animal protein, but it doesn't mean that it would have no impact at all. And then some of the other studies that I think are really interesting are, in 2016, Dr. Song from Harvard did the very first study looking at what would happen if you took 3% of calories from animal protein and replaced it with plant protein. Now, to put this into perspective, 3% of calories in a 2,000 calorie diet was kind of standard for most people. Men might have a little more, but for women, for sure. If you looked at that 2,000 calorie diet, you'd be looking at 60 calories. That's less than 1 large egg. It's about the amount of protein you would find in an ounce of processed meat or or, an ounce and a half of meat. So we're looking at this very small swap of calories from meat or eggs or dairy to beans. And they found that if what you were replacing was processed meat, your risk of death dropped 34%. If it was eggs, it was 19. If it was unprocessed meat, it was 12. I think it was 8 for dairy and something like 6 for poultry or fish. And then there have been several studies since that have used the same metric and come up with very, very similar results. So we know that plant protein provides a very distinct advantage in that regard over animal protein. And so that's worth saying. But generally, we want our diet to, first of all, to provide a reasonable balance of all of the macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrate, to provide sufficient protein, but also to provide sufficient phytochemicals and antioxidants and micronutrients. And so we don't want to swap out fruits and vegetables and whole grains and, all of these wonderful foods for concentrated protein source that provides none of the above.
Yeah.
Protein powders and so forth. And so we need to be aware a lot of the really concentrated protein sources just don't come packaged with the good things Whole Foods come packaged with.
Yeah, and that's really important because if you are really going for protein on the much, much higher end, it's going to be at a cost because we can only eat so much food in a day. And so,
That's
in
correct.
order to reach those levels, something else is going to have to be taken out. And if you're going for high protein, it's going to be like the fruits and the vegetables, right? But that's where all like the antioxidants and all those micronutrients and all that really good, important stuff for our health, and also the fiber as well. Well, a lot of fiber as well. So I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind, and really thinking about, well, if you are going for super high levels, what is the cost of that? And is that, is it necessary? And from what it sounds like, it's not necessary.
No.
One of the things that I just love about eating a whole food plant-based diet is that I can naturally get what I need and even more protein than I need, and also all of the mix of macronutrients by just eating, by just focusing on healthy whole plant foods. And it's like, I have so much to think about in any given day. Like, that's the last thing I want to think about is like making sure, and I know that there's, we need to make sure that we are eating really varied and whole plant foods and incorporating beans and tofu and all of that. But once you start eating like this, it's second nature. You eat all the good stuff.
It does become second nature. Yeah. And it's, for some people, it makes sense to think about, what's my protein source for this meal?
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people will just do the pasta and tomato sauce or, some sort of fairly low protein combination, and adding a little lentils to that sauce, or, these very simple, some people would just have a salad with, some quinoa or something. Quinoa is a reasonable protein source, but adding a few chickpeas or some tofu cubes will boost that protein content very significantly.
Yes. Yeah. And that's an edamame. I was looking in your the charts for your different foods and different protein content, and edamame is like,
through the roof. Yes,
through the roof.
A very rich source.
And how yummy and easy is it to, put some edamame beans on your salad or whatever you're eating, or just having it as a little snack.
So for senior women, I have had a number of people come to me saying, my skin is super thin. I'm losing my hair. My skin is breaking and bleeding. I'm tired. I feel weak. I've got brittle nails. I'm having all of these issues since I became plant-based. And all of the doctors I talk to, the plant-based doctors say, you don't have to worry about protein. If you're eating a variety of whole plant foods, you get plenty of protein. Could I be low? And in fact, often when I analyze the diets of these women, they're getting about 40 grams of protein a day. We bring them to 60 or 70 grams. and all of these issues resolve. So just be aware that it is possible not to get enough protein, especially as an older woman who's not eating a lot of food. And to go from 40 to 70 grams of protein can be as simple as using soy milk instead of almond milk on your cereal, adding a few hemp seeds, having a third of a cup of tofu cubes on your salad, adding a little bit of some sort of extra beans or tofu to your dinner. It is really easy to bring that level up. And I can remember with one client, we just had to make 3 small changes in her diet that she hardly even noticed, and we got her from 40 to 70. Just like that. So I just wanted to mention that because I think it's really important to recognize that it is possible not to get enough protein on a plant-based diet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great reminder, and I'm really happy that you added that. So thank you very much. We have to be mindful, It's like we have to be mindful, and we have to be an advocate for ourselves, and really making sure that this is, we're doing this in a way that's best going to support us. So I think that's a very good clarification. I'm going to go over to our private Facebook group, and I'm just going to pull up some of these questions. And I think I'm going to skip the ones that we've already covered because I know that we've covered a lot of them. So Tracy asks, I like to eat a very light breakfast first thing in the morning, but I want it to be high in protein. Other than vegan protein powder, how can I get a lot of protein in a relatively small amount of food?
This is a great question. I think there's 2 really easy ways to do it. A lot of people that like a light breakfast will opt for a smoothie. Smoothies, it's the easiest thing. Use soy milk, use hemp seeds, add some frozen peas or some soft tofu. So think protein as you're making your smoothie. And then if you're eating solid foods, I think one of the nicest light meals is a chia pudding with some fruit and maybe some seeds sprinkled on top or some walnuts. But in the chia pudding, the way I make my chia pudding is I use soy milk that has 8 grams of protein per cup. And then I add hemp seeds. And my sweetener for my chia pudding is prunes, so dried prunes. So I put in, a fair bit of hemp seeds and some dried prunes and some vanilla, blend it in the blender, add the hemp seeds, and you've got, or add the chia seeds, and the chia seeds are an amazing source of calcium, as is a fortified soy milk. So an unsweetened soy milk. And so you're getting a great dose of calcium. If you're eating a reasonable portion, you can easily get 15 or 20 grams of protein, especially if you're adding some nuts and seeds on top as well.
Okay, great suggestions. Do you blend your chia seeds when you do that?
No, you do not want to blend chia seeds for a chia pudding.
Okay.
Because the chia seeds, grow, and that's what, makes the chia pudding fun and tasty. If you blended them, it would be kind of a funny chia pudding. Now, blending them or turning them into a powder is great, just like flax seeds for sprinkling on things. But not so much for making a chia pudding.
Okay, good. Okay, so the cat asks, why are we so obsessed with protein?
I think protein is got a halo, and it has for a long time, because protein is so associated with muscle mass, and men want muscles. It's been the one macronutrient that hasn't been blamed for everything that ails us generally. I think Colin Campbell may be a slight exception to that, but carbohydrates have been thought of as the evil, villain of the diet. Fat in the 80s especially was thought of as the evil villain. And, protein, we haven't seen that because in our culture, we associate protein with strength. And making it kind of, bulletproof, I guess, if you will.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. Do you notice, like, have you seen throughout your years of doing what you're doing, have you noticed like waves of times when the protein talk, throughout society kind of spikes and then kind of dips? Because it seems like for me, it seems like we go through these waves of like, okay, people are pretty cool about protein. And then every once in a while it'll be like, oh my God, we need a lot more. We're going to freak out about protein. And then it kind of gets quiet. Have you noticed that at all?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it is definitely on the upswing right now.
Yes.
There's a
Yes.
lot of emphasis on protein and shifting guidelines suggesting higher needs for older individuals and, higher needs for athletes and so forth. So we've always valued it, but in the last few years, it's definitely on the upswing, our concern
Mhm.
about protein.
Mhm. What are the protein needs of postmenopausal women trying to build muscle and lose fat? We covered a little bit, but do you just want to hit on that real quick to recap?
Yeah, and if you're training, seriously training to try to build muscle, you may want to boost your intake to 1.4 or 1.5, somewhere in there. For myself, I stick to around 1.2 as a postmenopausal woman, but I'm a pretty muscular woman
Uh-huh.
and I've maintained that muscle. I'm not trying to add muscle, I've got enough.
Okay, so if you're trying to add muscle, maybe a little bit more. And
Exactly.
if you're trying to maintain, then and then here's the
But it's
question.
not a matter of just increasing protein intake because just increasing protein intake without the physical stress, the weight bearing
Yes.
exercise will do nothing. That
Right.
protein will get converted into sugar and stored, or used or converted to fat and stored.
Yes.
So
Good.
it's
Good.
it's
Yeah.
your protein will go to build muscle if you're stressing those muscles.
Right. So do those weight bearing exercises. Um,
Yes,
yeah, and that's an important thing. Just because you eat more protein doesn't mean all of a sudden you'll magically have more muscle. That's a very good
exactly.
clarifying. So there's also a lot of talk about the timing of protein intake. So before or after a workout, is that better? Should we be going for a certain amount of protein at each meal? Can you talk about the timing a little bit?
We've debated this topic a little bit over the years. I would say it matters less than some people, think it might.
Okay.
So what matters more is the total protein intake and that it be, um, be provided at reasonably consistent times throughout the day. A lot of people talk about, having it within an hour or whatever of your physical exercise. And if you're a really serious bodybuilder or something like that, that might make sense. But for most people, just meeting your total protein needs by eating protein, in each of your 3 meals is very reasonable.
Okay. So this is like per day, as long as you're meeting your requirements per day, it
That's
shouldn't matter as
right.
much as the timing unless you have a very specific, a very hardcore weightlifting kind of routine working out. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. I've seen a lot of recommendations for seniors. I'm 66 to get in more protein. How much is really necessary? I think we covered that very
Yes,
well.
you're the exact same age as I am. So, and I go for 1.2, but 1 to 1.2 is probably a really reasonable place to be.
1 to 1.2 per kilogram of body weight a day.
Exactly.
And so you just
Yeah.
have to do that calculation. So
Based on your healthy body weight.
yes, if your actual body weight isn't your healthy body weight, then it's on your healthy body weight. Great. Okay. What is the best way to, nicely let somebody know, um, who, if somebody says like you need more protein, you aren't getting enough, who's really adamant about it. What is a good way to, advocate for yourself and say, hey, no, I'm going to be okay. Like, do you have a certain script that you go to or certain points that you make?
There are different ways of approaching it, but I've always found being respectful is really helpful. especially as we're trying to encourage other people towards a more compassionate, more ecologically sensible way of eating. And so making a connection with them is more important than defending ourselves. So one of the things that I would do is I would say, that's so interesting. So could you share with me some of your resources that might suggest that? And would you be okay with me sharing some of my resources with you as well? And maybe we can learn from one another. We always have something to learn from another person. And so when we go about it in a way that, respects their knowledge, maybe they'll respect ours as well. And there's so many very high quality summaries of this information and studies that have been done that we could share with them. And they might be open to that. So that's the way that I would go about it, just very kindly.
I love that answer. And we can definitely put some of those resources in the show notes of this episode for people to take if they want to look at them. Okay, so Cassandra says postmenopause tips for getting enough protein without a surplus of calories. We've talked about this a little bit, but do you have any other sort of like protein boosters to help people up a little bit? I mean, we've talked about
Yes.
tofu and lentils and edamame, soy milk. What others do you have?
One of the things that I've had to do to maintain my weight and not gain weight as a postmenopausal woman is I've had to shift my the makeup of my meals a bit. So I tend to eat fewer starchy foods like grains and starchy vegetables, and more non-starchy vegetables and things from the legume family.
Mhm.
So to give you an example, when I cook my cereal, my cereal is typically kamut berries, oat groats, quinoa. So I'll take intact grains, but I'll add a little bit of lentils to them to boost the protein content of that meal. I always make a chia pudding to have with those intact grains. I, add my little bit of fruit, but I also have a seed mix that goes on top as well. And a dehydrated granola that's loaded with seeds, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, all of those. I always use unsweetened soy milk as my non-dairy milk. My salads, I use as the toppings. I like to do full meal salads. Every lunch is a giant salad. But I make my, so if I had quinoa or some sort of, sweet potato or something, I will have a smaller serving of that and a larger serving of the tofu cubes and the hummus or the edamame or whatever. And then my salad dressing, I would never use a sort of a sugar-based dressing. I want my dressing to have more protein and more nutrients and a little bit of fat so I can absorb the fat-soluble nutrients in the salad. So it'll be a tahini hemp seed dressing. And that provides much more protein than a sugar-based or a no-fat kind of dressing. And so each meal, I think about, those little boosts that you can get in. And I don't really eat snacks, but if I did, I would focus more on things like apple pieces with nut butter or something like that. Or the one thing that we have on our counter is nuts in the shell. I might crack open a nut or two if I feel really hungry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, just kind of shifting things a little bit depending on where you're at in life. I think that
Yes.
is very sensible, and those are all very good suggestions. So we did talk about this. Catherine said Dr. Stacy Sims, and that's the article that we were talking about before.
Yes.
For perimenopausal and menopausal women, daily protein needs increase to about 2 to 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. So it says, as we age, our bodies become more resistant to muscle building effects of protein and exercise, requiring higher doses of both. She says, I get so confused because this seems to contrast with what I've read on Molly's blog and in this group. I do worry a lot about not getting enough without supplementing with plant-based protein shakes and making myself susceptible to low bone density and muscle loss.
Yes, so I would say that there are not many protein experts, I think, that would agree with her recommendations. They are excessive, they're very difficult to achieve, and I think for a lot of people that are following those guidelines, they're doing it with animal-based protein, which can have significant negative consequences. And so, plant-based diets naturally provide a little less protein, but it doesn't mean we can't get adequate. And the weight of the evidence is adequate for postmenopausal women is probably closer to 1.2. If you're very active, if you have sarcopenia, you may want to go up to 1.5 or somewhere in that range. But I've never seen any recommendations that would suggest an intake of 2 to 2.3. It's just excessive. And so I would, I would just aim for a more reasonable intake and not worry about it. And I can say for myself that my, muscle mass, my strength, my ability to do push-ups, that kind of stuff has not changed one iota as I'm aging at, 66 years of age. I can still do easily, 25 or 30 or more men's push-ups. So
Nice.
it's, I'm managing without
Yeah.
that kind of ridiculously high intake.
Veganism and osteoporosis. Somebody wants to know about that.
Yeah, so I will just say that what we know based on the research is there's no question vegans have a higher risk.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, we've seen it in Epic Oxford, we've seen it in the Adventist Health Study too. The weight of the evidence suggests we're at higher risk. And there are many reasons for that. One is that we're leaner. So we have the lowest body mass index of all people eating a variety of dietary patterns. We're usually within the healthy BMI range. As a matter of fact, in the Adventist Health Study too, vegans were the only dietary category within the healthy BMI range. Everybody else was above. So we're leaner, which means we'll have a little less bone and we'll be at slightly higher risk because of that. We also tend to get less vitamin D, less calcium, less protein. Those are all nutrients that are important for maintaining healthy bones. And so, and they're not the only nutrients. We need enough omega-3 fatty acids. We need enough vitamin A. We need enough zinc. We need enough B12. All of these things. So B12 is another nutrient that may fall short. So the key is to get a balanced, varied diet and make sure we're meeting the recommended intakes, especially for calcium and vitamin D, where bone health is concerned. And so, in fact, in the Adventist Health Study too, women had a 55% higher risk of osteoporosis, but they didn't if they were getting enough calcium and vitamin D. And so those are issues that we need to consider. And, I live in Canada, so there are probably 6 to 8 months of the year that I'm not making enough vitamin D, even if I have exposure to the sun. So it needs to be warm sunshine to make enough vitamin D. Most people do not get enough vitamin D through sunshine. And in a plant-based diet, we don't eat fish, we don't eat eggs. We do sometimes drink fortified non-dairy milks, but we're not going to get enough from that. Mushrooms are, if they're exposed to light, they're a wonderful source. And as a matter of fact, you can buy mushrooms from the grocery store, put them on a cookie sheet, turn them a bottom side up, put them out in the sun for 15 minutes or so if it's a warm day. And a serving of those mushrooms will meet your RDA for vitamin D.
Oh, interesting.
So that's a trick, because you don't always know if they've been exposed to sunlight, because we know mushrooms that have been exposed are higher in vitamin D, but you don't know. So you can do this little trick yourselves just when you buy your mushrooms. If it's a warm, sunny day, they can go outside, and that vitamin D will last in those mushrooms for the week as you're storing them in the refrigerator. So that's a good source. But for most people, you're not going to be eating that serving of mushrooms every single day necessarily. It makes sense to take a supplement. And I just take 1,000 IUs. Some people need 2. Some people need even more to get their blood levels to where they need to be. But all of that having been said, if you eat enough protein, enough calcium, enough vitamin D, enough of all the other nutrients, it's still not enough to protect your bones unless you're telling your bones they've got to stay strong. You need to be doing weight-bearing exercise. It's like it's a message to your bones to stay strong. And so, yeah, we need to be, vegans are at lower risk for heart disease. They're lower risk for cancer. They're lower risk for cataracts, lower risk for diabetes, and it goes on and on and on. Lower risk for almost all of the chronic degenerative diseases. But that is not the case for osteoporosis. So we need to be vigilant when it comes to bone health.
Okay. And you talk about that in this book too, and you explain it really well, and like kind of the mechanism by which building muscle helps bone be strong. So again, for more, pick up this book. Wonderful. Okay, so we get a lot of questions in the group about using protein powders in various ways and asking for recommendations on best ones. So I just want to talk to you about protein powder. Another question was, is pea protein isolate powder better for you than regular protein powder with added ingredients? So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so where protein powders are concerned, I would say there are several issues that you want to consider. Generally, when you get a mix of different protein sources in the powder, it's better because you're getting a better mix of essential amino acids. And some proteins, like potato protein, for example, has an unbelievable amino acid profile. It's shocking. Potatoes are pretty low in protein, but when you extract the protein and concentrate it, it's really decent. And so some of these mixed protein powders are actually quite good. Now, what you need to be cautious of is protein powders often are contaminated with heavy metals and other contaminants that are not stuff you want to be consuming too much of. And if you're using it on a daily basis, you can go to the Clean Label Project. You can look for third-party certification. You can do those kinds of things to try to select, a good quality protein powder. Then the other thing is to look at the ingredient list. Are there added, preservatives and sugars and artificial sweeteners and all of that garbage? You don't want that stuff. You want it to be a really clean protein powder. Certainly, hemp protein or pea protein are very decent options and can be used. I have never used a protein powder. And I don't find it necessary. My diet is really good. But there are some individuals who are eating, a low number of calories and find it, really difficult to meet the recommended intakes. And so for those individuals, adding a little protein powder to their smoothie is really helpful. And if that's you, it's all good. Just try to find one that is a good quality product.
Okay.
And there are some excellent summaries of that.
Yeah. Okay. And maybe we can share that in the show notes as well so people can go and kind of check that out. I listened to a talk last Sunday by Dr. Clapper, and it was a really great talk, and he was talking about protein powder. He shared the same general sentiments that you did about it, but he said to watch out for the amount that you're adding in one dose, because he said that it could affect the liver if you're getting too much protein powder at once.
Yes, so because it's so concentrated, and your body has to process it, you don't want to be having massive amounts all at once. Most of the time, you're doing one scoop, they call it, and it might have 20 grams or something like that, which is absolutely fine.
Okay.
But if you're dosing it at a very high level, that's not a good idea. And if you are wanting to do it more than once a day, most people don't need that.
Yeah.
Once a day for most individuals would be plenty, unless you're a really serious competitive bodybuilder
Right.
where you're aiming for 1.6 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. Then you may be going a little higher. But I find it easy enough to get the protein up in a smoothie easily with hemp seeds, peas, soft tofu, soy milk, without the need for any protein powder.
Yeah. That's what I do as well. So, and I think that's what he said too, like 20 grams is good, but like you
Yeah.
might not want to do more than that. Okay. Oh, how many grams of protein can I utilize at any time? For example, if I eat a meal containing 50 grams of protein, can my body absorb that all at once?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I can answer that accurately. It will depend on the individual. It will depend on your size. It will depend on how much protein your body actually needs at that moment. But generally, most of the research I've seen suggests around 30 grams is, sort of where you land for a meal
Yeah.
that you can utilize efficiently. But I'm guessing a little bit because it would be different for different people. But I think for most people, aiming for 20, 25 grams per meal is very reasonable, especially for women. For men, it might be a little bit higher than that if they're a larger person. But generally, we're in the range of 20 to 30 grams for most of us.
Okay. Great. Great question. And okay, this was the last question. How do you get enough protein if you are allergic to soy and pea protein? I mean, we've talked about many different sources, but if you're allergic to soy and pea protein, it's going to need to be a lot of different legumes, I would imagine, and hemp seeds as well.
Yes, so soy is probably one of the best sources of protein in the plant-based diet. It's pretty concentrated at very high quality, and it's fun. You can do so much with tofu and edamame and so on. So it's such a bummer if you're allergic to it. But if you are, there are 14,000 kinds of legumes, probably 20 or so of which are a part of the regular diet. And so you don't need soy. You don't need, what was the other thing they
Pea
were?
protein.
Pea protein. You don't need soy. You don't need pea protein to get enough protein. It's, legumes. One of the things you can do if you want to boost the protein, you can get almond plus protein milk, which will have some sort of, it's often pea. So what you can do is you can take your almond milk and blend it with hemp seeds and then pour it back into the container and boost your protein to about the same as what you would get from soy milk. And that's a nice way of doing it. And it's yummy. It makes it thick and creamy and it's delicious. And then, pumpkin seeds are a very good source of protein. Nuts tend to be a little on the lower side than compared to seeds. Seeds are especially, but especially hemp and pumpkin seeds. So between all of the other legumes, if you're not allergic to gluten, seitan is actually a pretty good source. And it's actually fairly high in branched chain amino acids, which is good for muscle building, like leucine. It's one of the best sources. So it's a little lower in lysine, but if you're eating legumes as well, you're going to get plenty of that. So So certainly you can add in a bit of seitan as a sort of more concentrated protein source if you like.
I would say get a order a bunch of beans from Rancho Gordo. They have the best beans and always so many fun beans to choose from.
Oh yeah. Isn't that fun when you discover a bean you've never even seen before and they're
I
so
love it.
pretty and oh yeah, and the colors and they're just so awesome. Or if you grow food. I
Yeah.
remember growing scarlet runner beans and they're just so pretty.
Oh, that's so
So yeah,
cool.
it can be lots of fun.
Yeah. And we didn't even get into leucine. That was like a very interesting part in this book as well. And that's very important. Can we just have that be the last thing before we wrap up? Just talking about
Sure.
leucine and the importance and some good sources?
Yeah, so leucine is, one of the amino acids that's especially important as we get older and for retaining and building muscle. And so, as I mentioned, again, legumes, soy, but gluten is a really rich source. So those are key. And then seeds again. It's all, regardless of what amino acid you're talking about. The main concentrated sources in a plant-based diet are the legume kingdom and the nut and seed kingdom are good sources as well.
Okay, excellent. Well, I feel like this was a little mini masterclass in plant-based protein. And so I really want to thank you for coming on and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. I feel like I have a lot more, I feel like kind of what I know, I can be confident of what I know is kind of like good information. And I don't have to update my thinking too much about recommendations and stuff like that. So I thank you for clearing some of this stuff up and just, having a great
My
conversation.
pleasure, and so nice to be with you and to see you again. And I hope it's helpful to everyone. And just don't lose too much sleep over it. Just think about, what is my source of protein with this meal? Are there little ways that I can boost my protein intake? Switching from almond to soy milk, or adding some hemp seeds to my almond milk and blending it, or whatever. Adding some edamame to my salad. It's really pretty easy to boost your protein intake in a plant-based diet.
Yeah, and the only thing is what you're going to find is the more whole plant foods you're going to eat, the more you're crowding out the processed kind of, foods that are not so good for you. And so that's not a bad thing, and if that means like, okay, I need to, make sure that every meal counts and making sure that I'm getting enough protein at every meal and enough throughout the day, then that just might mean getting rid of some of the stuff in the diet that's not really helping you anyway. So
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Brenda Davis. I always like talking with you. Have a beautiful day.
Well, you too, Molly. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Did you know that Clean Food Dirty Girl has a club? We do. It's called the Clean Food Dirty Girl Meal Plan Club. And if you want to eat more plant-based meals that are delicious, that are damn good, that will have you craving them, if you want to feel energized and healthy from head to toe, if you want to save time in the kitchen each week, if you want to use all of the groceries that you actually buy, and if you want the omnivores in your life to say, yum, to the plant-based meals that you're cooking, you have got to join us. Go to cleanfooddirtygirl.com, and on the homepage, you can find out more. I would love to see you in the club. It is the best. Come find out what all the buzz is about. It is life-changing, and I would love to have you. Thank you for listening to this podcast and for being in our sphere. If you can rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to them, that would be badass. Thank you so much for spreading the dirty love.